Be me, 24, living in the city and trying to figure out my life. More specifically, trying to figure out dating. A few years ago, I decided I was done with the usual kind of guys. The ones who make lazy jokes, expect you to laugh, and think being emotionally distant is a personality trait. It felt like I was constantly having to educate them, constantly having to explain basic things. It was just draining. My friends and I talked about it all the time. We all came to the same conclusion. It's better to be single than to settle for someone who doesn't get it. So I made a rule for myself, a hard rule. I would only date men who identified as feminists, true allies. My dating profile was crystal clear about it. Had a whole paragraph explaining that I was looking for a partner who was actively working to dismantle the patriarchy. No fragile masculinity, no not all men arguments. A lot of guys unmatched me immediately. Good. System works. Eventually, I matched with Clyde. His profile was like a checklist of everything I was looking for. He had his pronouns in his bio, a picture of him at a protest march, and a list of his favorite progressive authors. It felt like finding a diamond in the rough. We started talking, and he was incredible. He'd ask about my day and then connect it to broader societal issues. He never interrupted me, not once. He always validated my feelings, always. So we decided to meet up for a coffee. He was nice, looked like his pictures. A bit thin, wore glasses, seemed gentle. The first weird sign came when we were trying to decide on a cafe. I said I was fine with anything and asked what he felt like. He got this serious look on his face. He said he didn't want to impose his own preference because it could be seen as an act of patriarchal dominance. He insisted that as a woman, my choice should take priority to counteract historical imbalances. I thought it was a little intense, but also sweet. It showed he was thinking about things on a deeper level. We stood on the sidewalk for about 10 minutes, having a philosophical debate about where to get a latte. I finally just picked a place because I was getting cold. Once we were inside, he spent most of the time apologizing. He apologized for taking up too much conversational space, even though I was asking him questions. He apologized for the gender pay gap, as if he'd personally caused it. He even apologized for the barista being a man, saying it was a sign of how men invade traditionally female-coded service spaces. It was a lot, but I figured he was just nervous and trying to show me he was safe. I decided to give him another chance. We started dating, and the intensity never went away. It got worse. Making any kind of decision with him was impossible. Picking a movie for movie night would take hours. He'd research every director and screenwriter to make sure they'd never said anything problematic on social media. Most of the time, we just ended up watching some obscure documentary from the 70s about labor unions, because it was the only unproblematic option. I tried to watch a normal action movie once, a classic one I liked. He sat through the first 20 minutes in silence, then he paused it. He told me he needed to process the violent masculinity being portrayed on screen. He actually started to tear up. He said it was just so hard for him to watch men solve problems with aggression instead of communication. We never finished the movie. Every interaction was like this. I couldn't just have a normal conversation. Everything had to be analyzed. If I said I had a tough day at work, he'd launch into a lecture about late-stage capitalism. If I complained about a headache, he'd explain how the medical field has historically downplayed female pain. I know he meant well, but I didn't feel like I had a boyfriend. I felt like I had a full-time social justice commentator living in my head. He was also incredibly unhelpful in any practical sense. One evening, I was trying to open a jar of pickles. The lid was stuck tight. I handed it to him, just by instinct. He held it for a second, then set it back down on the counter. He explained that asking a man to open a jar for a woman reinforces the harmful stereotype that women are physically weak and men are strong providers. He suggested we work on it collaboratively. He held the base of the jar while I twisted the lid. It still didn't budge. After 5 minutes of this, I just ran it under hot water and opened it myself, while he nodded approvingly, saying it was a great example of non-gendered problem-solving. I just wanted a pickle. The physical side of our relationship was clinical. He would ask for explicit verbal consent for everything. Before holding my hand, before putting his arm around me, before a kiss. At first, I thought it was respectful, but after a while, it just killed any kind of spontaneity. It felt less like romance and more like we were filling out paperwork before every interaction. There was no passion, just a constant, cautious process of negotiation. He never seemed to want anything for himself. His only desire was to be what he thought I wanted him to be. But because he was so busy trying to be the perfect ally, he had no personality of his own. I found myself getting more and more irritated with him. I'd see other couples laughing and joking, and I felt this weird pang of jealousy. Our relationship wasn't fun. It was work. The final straw happened a few months in. I bought a new framed print for my apartment. I asked him if he could help me hang it. This led to a 45-minute discussion. He was worried about the act of drilling a hole in the wall being a symbolically violent phallic act. He wasn't sure if he, as a man, should be the one to do it. He asked if maybe I wanted to be the one to use the drill, to reclaim the tool as a symbol of female empowerment. I told him I'd never used a drill and was worried I'd mess it up. He nodded, saying my fear was a product of societal conditioning. He just stood there, theorizing about the drill. I eventually just grabbed a hammer and a nail and hung the picture myself, crookedly. He watched me, then told me he was proud of me for seizing agency. I looked at this man, who was so lost in his own ideology that he couldn't perform the simplest of tasks, and I just felt nothing. Not attraction, not even friendship, just pity. I broke up with him that night. I sat him down and tried to be gentle. I told him he was a really kind person, but we just weren't a match. He didn't get sad. He didn't get angry. He pulled out his phone and opened a notes app. He said he understood, and that this was a valuable learning experience for him. He asked me to provide detailed feedback on his shortcomings so that he could do better in his next allyship role. I had to sit there for an hour and give him a performance review on our relationship. It was the most surreal conversation of my life. When I was done, he thanked me for my emotional labor and left. I felt so empty afterwards. I talked about it with my friends, of course. They were supportive. They said Clyde was just a performative ally, not a real one. He was all talk, all emotion, but no real substance. The problem wasn't my standards. It was that I'd picked the wrong kind of male feminist. What I needed, they said, was someone who wasn't just emotional, but intellectual. Someone who understood the theory behind it all. It made sense to me. Clyde was too caught up in his feelings of guilt. I needed someone with conviction, someone with a strong theoretical framework. So I got back on the apps. This time, I was even more specific. My bio now said I was looking for an intellectually rigorous partner. That's when I met Nelson. Nelson's profile didn't have pictures of him at protests. Instead, it had long, dense paragraphs quoting theorists and talking about his ongoing project of deconstructing late-stage capitalist patriarchy. He was a grad student in sociology. It seemed perfect. Our first date was at a bookstore, and he was everything Clyde wasn't. He was confident. He didn't ask for my opinion. He told me what the correct, structurally aware opinion was. He'd pick up a book, read the back, and then deliver a 5-minute lecture on why the author was problematic. He didn't seem to care what I thought, but he was so sure of himself that I found it kind of compelling. It felt like he had all the answers. Compared to Clyde's constant indecisiveness, Nelson's certainty was refreshing. He didn't apologize for being a man. He saw his role as using his position of privilege to educate others. Mostly me, it seemed. We started seeing each other. The dynamic was completely different. He never asked me what I wanted to do. He just informed me that we were going to a free screening of a political film or attending a lecture on post-colonial theory. He said mainstream entertainment was bread and circuses, designed to numb the working class. I was so tired of Clyde's inability to make a choice that I just went along with it. After a month or so, he told me his housing situation was unstable due to the precarious nature of academic funding. He asked if he could stay with me for just a couple of weeks. I had a spare room, so I said yes. He showed up with a backpack full of books and his laptop. That was it. The couple of weeks turned into a month, then 2. I realized pretty quickly that he didn't actually do anything. He would sit on my couch all day on his laptop. He claimed he was doing research for his thesis, but it looked a lot like he was just getting into arguments in comment sections online. He never cooked, he never cleaned. When I asked him to help with chores, he had a whole theory ready. He explained that the very concept of chores was a construct designed to assign unpaid domestic labor, disproportionately affecting women. He said that by asking him to participate, I was reinforcing the system instead of questioning it. He said the truly radical act was to reject domestic labor altogether. So I was the one who kept cleaning the apartment, my apartment. He didn't have a job, and he never seemed to have any money. He used my stuff, ate my food, and acted like it was his right. He'd say things like, "From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs." Apparently, my ability was to work a full-time job, and his need was to sit on my couch and use my Wi-Fi. My friends loved him at first. When they'd come over, he'd hold court in the living room. He'd explain all the complicated theories they'd only read about online. They thought he was a genius. They didn't see him refusing to take out the trash because it was a performance of bourgeois hygiene standards. They didn't see him using the last of my milk and not even thinking to replace it. Slowly, the certainty that I'd found so attractive started to feel like arrogance. He wasn't confident. He was just a narcissist who had learned to use academic jargon to justify his laziness. There was no partnership. I was just the host for his parasitic lifestyle. I tried talking to him about it once, gently. I suggested that maybe he could get a part-time job just to help with bills. He looked at me with this wounded expression. He accused me of having internalized capitalist values. He said I was trying to force him into the role of the male provider, which was a toxic, patriarchal expectation. He told me his intellectual labor was far more valuable than any menial job I wanted him to get. He managed to twist it so that I was the one who was in the wrong. I ended up apologizing to him. Living with him was exhausting in a new and different way. Clyde was exhausting because he demanded constant emotional validation. Nelson was exhausting because he was a black hole of entitlement who contributed nothing. One day, I came home from work, completely beat. I'd bought a new bookshelf from IKEA because my old one was falling apart. It was in a big, heavy, flat-pack box in the hallway. I thought, okay, this is something we can do together. A team project. I asked Nelson if he could help me put it together. He looked at the box and scoffed. He told me he refused to participate in the performance of manual labor. He said the act of assembling prefabricated furniture was a deeply alienating process that separated the worker from the product of their labor. He then gave me a 15-minute lecture on Marx, while the bookshelf just sat there in the box. I was too tired to argue. I just left it there. It stayed in the hallway for over a week. Every day I'd come home and have to step over this giant cardboard box that was a monument to his uselessness. I started to feel a deep, simmering resentment. I had followed all the rules, I had picked the right men, and all I had to show for it was a string of bizarre, frustrating experiences. I was lonelier in my relationship with Nelson than I ever was when I was single. At least, when I was single, I didn't have to clean up after a grown man who thought washing a dish was beneath him. I felt trapped. My friends all thought he was brilliant. If I complained, they'd probably just say I wasn't smart enough to appreciate him. And a part of me was afraid they were right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was just not evolved enough to be in a truly progressive relationship. So I stayed, and things just got worse. I felt like a stranger in my own home. My apartment was no longer my space. It was his lecture hall, and I was just the audience, and the janitor, and the cook, and the landlord. I was starting to think my entire philosophy on dating was a complete failure, but I had no idea what to do about it. I'd invested so much of my identity in this idea, in being the kind of woman who only dated these kinds of men. To admit it was wrong felt like admitting that I myself was wrong. So I just kept quiet and tried to endure it, until that one afternoon when everything changed. It was a Saturday, I think. I was in the kitchen trying to make lunch, and that's when I heard it. A weird gurgling sound coming from under the sink. I ignored the sound at first, hoping it would go away. It didn't. It got louder. I opened the cabinet under the sink and was hit with a blast of musty, damp air. A steady stream of murky water was leaking from one of the pipes. It was already forming a big puddle on the cabinet floor and starting to seep out onto the kitchen tiles. My heart started pounding. I've never been good with house problems. I don't know the first thing about plumbing. I yelled for Nelson. He wandered into the kitchen a minute later, holding his laptop, looking annoyed that I'd interrupted his work. "What?" he asked. I pointed at the spreading puddle of water. "The sink is leaking. A lot. We have to do something." He peered into the cabinet with a look of academic curiosity, as if it were an interesting specimen in a lab. "Fascinating," he said. "The decay of urban infrastructure is a key symptom of systemic neglect under neoliberalism." He wasn't looking for a solution. He was workshopping a thesis statement. "Can you just help me?" I pleaded. "I don't know what to do. Maybe we can turn off the water." He took a step back from the puddle. "I think it's important to recognize the gendered expectations at play here," he said calmly. "You're defaulting to the assumption that I, as the male-presenting person in the household, should possess some innate knowledge of manual repairs. That's a problematic stereotype." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Water was literally flooding my kitchen floor, and he was giving me a seminar. "I'm not assuming anything," I yelled. "I'm just asking for help because I'm freaking out." He held up his hands in a calming gesture. "Okay, let's deconstruct this. What is help? In this context, help is a request for me to perform a traditionally masculine-coded task which reinforces the very power structures we're trying to dismantle." He then pulled out his phone and started filming the leak. "This is perfect for my video essay on domestic decay," he said, framing the shot. That was it. Something inside me just snapped. I screamed at him to get out of the kitchen. He looked shocked, genuinely surprised by my outburst. He called it an unproductive expression of emotional distress and retreated back to the couch. I grabbed every towel I owned and threw them on the floor, but the water was coming out too fast. I felt utterly helpless. In a complete panic, I Googled emergency plumber near me on my phone. I called the first number that came up. A man answered, his voice gruff. "Plumbing?" I frantically explained the situation. He just said, "Okay, be there in an hour," and hung up. The hour felt like an eternity. I just sat on a kitchen chair, watching the towels get darker and heavier, while Nelson typed away furiously on his laptop in the other room. He didn't check on me once. Finally, the doorbell rang. I opened it, and there was the plumber. He was a normal-looking guy, maybe in his late 30s, shorter than me but solid. He had a faded t-shirt, jeans, and work boots. He wasn't smiling. He just looked at me and said, "Leaky pipe?" I nodded, and he walked past me into the kitchen, carrying a big, heavy-looking toolbox. He didn't even flinch at the mess. He set his toolbox down on a dry spot, crouched down, and looked under the sink. He didn't say anything for a minute, just looked. I was so used to endless talking and theorizing that the silence was jarring. He finally grunted. "Main valve under the sink is shot. I'll have to shut off the water to your unit." He told me where to find the main shut-off valve in the basement. I went and turned it off. When I came back up, he was already laying out his tools on a cloth on the floor. Wrenches and pliers and things I didn't recognize. They were old tools, worn and stained. They looked like they'd been used 1,000 times. He started working. As he worked, I felt this compulsive need to fill the silence. It's what I was used to. I tried to make conversation, using my usual script. "It must be hard," I said, leaning against the counter, "working in a field that's so dominated by, toxic masculinity." He didn't stop what he was doing. From under the sink, his voice was muffled. "It's a job. 2 words. That's all I got." I tried again. "I just think it's important for men to be aware of the space they occupy." There was a loud clanging sound as he tightened something with a wrench. "Okay," he said. He wasn't engaging, he wasn't being rude, but he also wasn't interested in my lecture. He was just focused on the pipe. I shut up. I just stood there and watched him. I watched his hands. They were calloused and capable. They moved with a kind of efficiency and purpose I hadn't seen in months. He wasn't thinking about the job. He was just doing it. I watched his arms tense as he cranked on a stubborn fitting. And in that moment, watching this complete stranger competently and silently solve a real physical problem that was causing me immense stress, I felt something. It was a weird, unfamiliar feeling, a jolt. It wasn't an intellectual appreciation. It was something more primal. I wasn't attracted to his mind or his ideology. I was attracted to his competence, the fact that he could do something useful. In 20 minutes, he was done. He crawled out from under the sink, wiping his hands on a rag. "All right," he said. "Go turn the main back on, slowly." I did. I came back upstairs, my heart racing, expecting the worst. But it was silent. No gurgling, no dripping. He was crouched down, watching the new pipe he'd installed. It was bone dry. "All set," he said, standing up. "Replace the valve and a section of the pipe. Used copper. It'll last." He started packing up his tools, each one going back into its specific spot in the box. He wrote out an invoice on a carbon paper pad. He tore off my copy and handed it to me. His name was Jake. I paid him. He folded the cash and put it in his wallet. "Thanks," he said, picking up his toolbox. He looked at the wet towels on the floor. "You'll want to get a fan on that. Prevent mold." And then he was gone. The whole thing, from the moment he arrived to the moment he left, took less than an hour. I stood there in my quiet, dry kitchen. The problem was just gone, solved. Nelson chose that moment to reappear. "Is the crisis of capitalism averted?" he asked with a smirk. I just stared at him, at his soft hands that had never fixed anything, at his smug face, so proud of its own uselessness. And I felt a wave of disgust so powerful it almost knocked me over. I told him to pack his books and get out. He was stunned. He immediately tried to turn it back on me, launching into a critique of my authoritarian communication style. I didn't argue. I didn't engage. I just stood by the door and waited. He finally realized I was serious. He stuffed his things into his backpack, muttering about my bourgeois property ethics. When he left, the silence in the apartment was the best thing I'd ever heard. That night, I was supposed to meet my friends for our weekly get-together. I almost canceled, but I decided to go. I needed to talk to someone. I got to the cafe, and they were already deep in discussion about a movie trailer they found problematic. I just sat there, quiet, letting their words wash over me. It all sounded so pointless, so disconnected from reality. They were deconstructing fictional worlds, while my own world had almost literally drowned. One of my friends noticed I was quiet and asked if I was okay. I took a deep breath, and then I just told them everything. About Clyde and his crying, about Nelson and his lectures, about the pipe bursting and how he just filmed it. And then I told them about the plumber. I told them how he didn't talk. He just worked. How he fixed a real problem with his own 2 hands. My voice started shaking a little. "You guys just don't get it," I said. "We sit here and we talk and talk and talk. We analyze everything to death. We've created this whole checklist of what a good man is supposed to be." I looked at their confused faces. And what did I get for it? I got men who can't open pickle jars. I got men who think fixing a leak is a problematic performance of gender. I got boys who are terrified of their own shadows. There was a stunned silence at the table. "Today," I continued, "for the first time in years, I saw a man, a grown man. He wasn't trying to be an ally. He wasn't asking for my approval. He just showed up and did what needed to be done." I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't care. I'm so tired of it. I'm so tired of weak men. I don't want a partner I have to constantly manage and validate and take care of. I don't want a student. I don't want a project. I took one last shuddering breath and said it. I just want a man who can actually do something. A real man. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere at the table froze. They looked at me like I had just sprouted a second head. My closest friend, Sarah, just shook her head slowly. "Wow," she whispered. "All this time, and you've learned nothing. You're just romanticizing toxic masculinity." Another friend chimed in. "Competence isn't a gendered trait, Zoe. You're falling for patriarchal propaganda." They started talking at me, not to me. They were diagnosing me, picking apart my internalized misogyny, explaining to me how I was wrong to feel what I felt. They sounded just like Nelson. I realized they weren't my friends. They were my echo chamber, and I had just smashed the mirror. I stood up. I didn't say goodbye. I just put some cash on the table for my coffee and walked out. I walked home alone through the city streets. I felt completely alone. I'd lost my boyfriend. I'd lost my friends. I'd lost the entire belief system that I had built my adult life around. All of it was gone. I got back to my apartment. It was quiet and clean. On the kitchen counter was the invoice. Jake, the plumber, with his company name and phone number on it. I picked it up and just looked at it for a long time. I didn't know what to do next. My entire map of the world was wrong, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I might actually be free. The problem was, I had no idea where to go from here.